Now to the high point of our evening, our opening keynote address, one of three keynote addresses which will be delivered over the coming days. Tomorrow we will hear from Dr. Bill Cassan of the London School of Economics, and on Saturday we have a keynote from Dr. Leanne Lane of Dublin City University. I'd like to hand you over now to my colleague, Dr. Mary McAuliffe, one of the organisers of the conference, to introduce tonight's keynote address. So would you please welcome to the stage Dr. Mary McAuliffe and Professor Diarmaid Ferriter.
Good evening and welcome to this conference in Kerry. As was mentioned earlier, this has been a year in planning between the three of us, Eoghan, Bridget and myself, and we're delighted to see you all here this evening and hopefully see many of you over the next 2 days at all the various events. A bit of housekeeping before we kick off on our keynote for this evening. Our keynote speaker, whom some of you may know, do I really need to introduce him at this stage? We'll speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then there will be a Q&A. There will be 2 roving mics on either side of the aisle, and those of you who want to ask any questions, just raise your hand and the mic will come into you. Please use the mic because it would be difficult to hear you up on the stage here. So, to get to the high point of this evening, I want to introduce my colleague from UCD, Professor Diarmaid Ferriter, who is a full professor and chair of modern history at UCD. He is author of numerous books, including The Transformation of Ireland, 1900 to 2000, published in 2004, Occasions of Sin, Sex and Society in Modern Ireland in 2009, Ambiguous Republic, Ireland in the 1970s, published in 2012, The Border, The Legacy of a Century of Anglo-Irish Politics in 2019, and most recently his book on the Civil War, Between Two Hells, The Irish Civil War, 2021. He is, as many of you would know, a regular television and radio broadcaster and indeed a weekly columnist with the Irish Times. In 2019, he was elected as a member of the Royal Irish Academy. Tonight, he will talk to us about faith, reason and betrayal, the Irish Civil War. Please welcome Professor Diarmaid Ferriter.
Good morning, Mary. Agwini Ushla, Accordia, Chostaraha, Cahirlach. Is Fleisure agus Honor Vordum Unso Anocht, agus Befalum of Wichas, Uchuranul, Don Custa Agraha, Mary, agus Bridget, agus Eoghan, as Quira, a Hortum, Vahanso, Anocht. As Gurmach give Galer, as the Vahanso. I come tonight not with a polished thesis or a definitive history of the Civil War. I come instead to offer some reflections on how we might mediate this tragedy 100 years on. To consider what's involved in researching the different layers of the Civil War. To reflect on the relevant mindsets. What motivated and drove the men and women of 100 years ago to do what they did? How might we consider their mindsets? How do we consider the impact on those who participated, on those who were scarred mentally, physically, materially? We do this 100 years on in a county that looms so large in the final vicious stage of the Civil War. And there were over 170 people killed in Kerry during the Civil War. We have to consider not just those who died, but also those who had to deal with the aftermath. I'm wary of certainty, of trenchantcy, of righteousness in relation to consideration of the Civil War. I came to history in UCD at the very end of the 1980s. I was taught by fine scholars in the 1990s, including about the Civil War. Some of them had very trenchant, very muscular views on the Civil War. I recall Professor Tom Garvin, for example, a great political scientist. insisting that the battle in 1922 was about the birth of Irish democracy, that it was a battle between democrats and dictators, between those who considered the Republic to be a transcendental moral entity, who were contemptuous of democracy and public opinion, and those who were there to save democracy. 1922 as the birth of the democracy that they were going to safeguard. And they had to kill in order to safeguard that democracy. They were unconditional Democrats on the pro-treaty side as far as he was concerned. I'm not convinced, 25 years on, that some of the labels, some of the polarities that we think about in relation to the Civil War will in any way suffice. Some of the very well-known Civil War characters were much less certain than some of the views that were being expressed 75 years after the event. Some of the assertions that were made when I was studying history were accusations. They didn't necessarily invite much understanding of mindsets. And we do need to consider the advice that was given by the distinguished Cambridge historian Richard Evans. It is not our job as historians to lecture the people of the past on how they should have done better. It is our job to try and understand them. What were the lights that guided them through these difficult years? Eamon de Valera was certainly struggling with that in the midst of the Civil War. He wrote a very revealing letter in September 1922 to Mary McSweeney, in which he suggested that reason rather than faith had been his master. Every instinct of mine, he wrote, would indicate that I was meant to be a dyed-in-the-wool Tory or even a bishop rather than the leader of a revolution. He perhaps would have made a very fine and effective bishop had he chosen that particular path. But he was struggling, as he put it, to stay on the same plane of unreason that he saw Mary McSweeney occupying. And it's a reminder that even on the same side, the anti-treaty side, there were different shades, there were different parameters, there were different contours. And we do need to consider the struggles that were going on, not just between one side and the other, but within the individual camps, the pro-treaty and the anti-treaty. We are aware now, I suppose, that the assuredness of the labelling is something we have to question. Brother against brother, green against green. These labels do not satisfy 100 years on. The writer George Russell made the point that both sides came to embrace what he called the one-dimensional mind, particularly in retrospect. But there were various shades in 1922 and 1923. And there were shadows, too, that were relevant, including the British shadow. Consider Winston Churchill's letter to Michael Collins in April 1922, before the outbreak of the Civil War, in which he insisted that the provisional government had to assert itself or perish and be replaced by some other form of control. And the import of his words was clear. Britain might re-enter the fray. Britain also insisted that this was now an Irish problem, but that British shadow remained. There were those who believed ultimately this was about personal power and ambition versus principle. But we have to stop seeing the Civil War through the prism of some of these leading political characters, or indeed military characters. Think of the personal costs for the rank and file when it came to the gathering Civil War clouds in the earlier months of 1922. The diary of Michael Rinn, for example, in Galway, a pro-treaty IRA soldier. And he recorded simply in the spring of 1922, I stand to lose at least 50% of my friendships and 70% of my acquaintanceships. He also recorded that he was growing weary of those who adopt an air and tone of moral superiority to all lesser men. Consider, too, the lingering birds of the treaty debates of late 1921 and early 1922, because they raised the question about whether Ireland's dilemma could be solved through realpolitik. But you were also dealing with the invoking of the ghosts of recent history. Frank Gallagher, for example, insisted that Ireland was not land or people. Ireland was the dead and the things the dead people would have done. Ireland is spirit, he insisted. How do you argue against that? You argue by insisting that now is for the living. It's not about dwelling on the dead. In order for Ireland to live, it was argued by the pro-treaty side, particularly as the Civil War got worse, that executions were justified and necessary. There were to be 83 state executions during the Civil War. The vast majority of those executed were of low rank, and that was not by accident, that was by design, a reminder of the important theme of class during this period. Cosgrave insisted there is no other way, that this was about taking the responsibility of government. It brings us back into that realm of 1922 and democracy and mandates. But as Bill Cassan has pointed out, if 1922 was about the birth of Irish democracy, why was there the failure to find a political solution? Irish democracy, of course, predated the treaty. So in the words of Bill Cassan, the vista of a heroic elite forcing democratic values down the throat of a recalcitrant population or society is not very persuasive and should not be taken at face value. But it's a reminder of the arch propaganda war that was going on, the battle to control the narrative of the Irish Civil War from a very early stage. There are many examples you could offer in relation to that. I've often heard the words of Kevin O'Higgins from his address to the Oxford Union in 1924 quoted. He referred to himself and his colleagues in the provisional government as 8 young men standing in City Hall amidst the ruins of one administration with the foundations of another not yet built and wild men screaming through the keyhole. It was poetic, it was memorable, but it was also arch propaganda. It was, of course, about seeking to dehumanize the opposition, to rob them of their rationality. The reductive approach, these were merely wild men, uncontrollable wild men. There were others who felt that the wrong battle was being fought. When the playwright Sean O'Casey came to reflect in the 1950s on his trilogy of plays in the 1920s, The Plough and the Stars, Juno and the Paycock, The Shadow of a Gunman, he suggested that civil war should only be fought for a great cause. And he went on to argue that we need to be careful of personal idealism. Good intentioned, well-meaning as it may be, its flame in a few hearts may not give rise to new life and hope for the many, but dwindle into ghastly funeral pyres. He felt the real cause should be a labour cause. But would that have been worth a civil war in 1922? Peadar O'Donnell, too, as an anti-treaty IRA man, felt ultimately that he was in the wrong war. We need to be conscious, too, of placing these dilemmas and this conflict in a much wider comparative context. Winston Churchill referred contemptuously to the wars of the pygmies in relation to the conflicts that were happening in the aftermath of the First World War. 4 million people died in these conflicts after 1918 up to 1923. The Irish death toll, of course, was very modest in the Civil War. Between 1,500 and 2,000 died. Consider what happened in Finland in its civil war in 1918 when 36,000 people died. Or the battles for independence in Estonia, where 12,000 died. Or Latvia, where 13,000 died. Ireland was in a different zone of violence. And historians and scholars are mapping the idea of Ireland as part of a global upheaval and a global disturbance during this post-First World War period. But Ireland was not part of that culture of defeat after the First World War that prompted what historians refer to as ultra-violence. There were certain restraining influences at work, and it may seem counterintuitive to think about restraint when it comes to the Irish Civil War. But we do need to consider that. The influence of the Catholic Church, the pastorals that were issued in relation to violence. Nonetheless, we don't find moral consistency in Ireland between 1922 and 1923. Yet we don't get the extremes of sadism that were described by the historian Anthony Beevor, for example, in relation to his recent study of the revolution and war in Russia. The hacking to death, the gouging, the boiling, the freezing, the scalping. We do need to place the violence in Ireland in a broader context. There were, of course, moments of terrible suffering and great brutality. And we need to think about what was involved mentally for those who were involved. 50 years after the Civil War, the former National Army soldier Sean Irwin wrote a letter to Michael Hayes, suggesting it fell to our lot to see the gruesome business of executions through. Is there any regard, he wondered, for the human emotion that was involved in that? Let us consider, too, the intense religiosity of that generation of 1922 to 1923. Erskine Childers firmly believed that his execution was very much part of God's plan. Consider, too, those who went on hunger strike, the men and women during this period, some of them for such lengthy periods that it did permanent physical and mental damage. But there was also running through it an intense religious strain. For what I am about to suffer, the hunger strikers said, I offer to the glory of God and the freedom of Ireland. The glory of God came first. The freedom of Ireland came second to many of them. Ernie O'Malley spent 41 days on hunger strike during the Civil War. He was disgusted to have to come off it. He wrote that the country has not as yet had sufficient voluntary sacrifice and suffering. He insisted there is not enough spirituality in our movement. We need to get back Ireland's real soul. He was not impressed with the resolve or lack of resolve of many of his colleagues as he saw it. And yet, in some respects, he was inured. He was protected. He was incarcerated, meaning the likelihood was that he would survive. But he also wrote those words about there not being sufficient voluntary sacrifice to Molly Childers, the widow of Erskine, suggesting, of course, a certain crassness, but also underlining the depth of his belief, the depth of that religiosity, and connecting it to the idea of the Republic as a living faith. This carries an emotional charge, and we have to take cognizance of that. We need to bring that emotional charge back to the generation who fought and who held it. We can look at the complexity of individuals. We don't have to arrive at neat conclusions. We don't have to pigeonhole them. The historian David Fitzpatrick made the point, for example, in relation to Harry Boland, that he was at once a dictator, an elitist, a populist, and a democrat, all at the same time. But the sincerity of his struggle could not be impugned. Nonetheless, we do need to be conscious of the contempt that was displayed for public opinion, the dismissiveness that was in evidence, the cynicism about politics. Liam Lynch, as Chief of Staff of the anti-treaty IRA, insisted that it was the soldiers of the IRA who had had to hew the way to freedom for politicians to follow. But others were less certain. Consider the young Frank O'Connor, for example, who was initially trenchant, But then as an internee, he came to lament the idea of faith in the Republic to the detriment of everything else. Too many mystical abstractions, he suggested, reduced life to a tedious morality play. I rarely thought, he wrote, I felt. And he also referred to those on his own side who insisted that the Republic was still in existence and would remain so despite what its citizens might think. There were others, of course, who had a foot in both camps. Consider the great playwright and confidant of W.B. Yeats, Lady Gregory, who referred in a diary entry in 1923 to different sections of one's own mind tilting towards the government or the Republicans, tilting to one side or the other for good or bad. She could not make her mind up. There were others who identified a great opportunity in 1922, particularly for the Labour cause and the Labour question. The great success of the Labour Party in the general election, for example, of June 1922. The great opportunity that was there. The nobility that was shown by the leader of the Labour Party, Tom Johnson, in providing some kind of parliamentary opposition, in calling for accountability, in questioning the legality as well as the morality of what was being done in the name of the state in 1922 and 1923. And yet Labour got squeezed. Their success in 1922 did suggest that many Irish voters were yearning for unheroic things. And yet the worse the Civil War got, the more polarised the politics around it became. And it was difficult for those who were seeking to highlight, for example, the appalling unemployment rates in 1922 and 1923. There were also those who considered themselves neutral. The legacy of the 1916 Rising and those who were involved in it and how that might play out during the Civil War. The historian Jimmy Wren looked at the allegiances of the GPO garrison in 1916. There were 572 in the GPO in 1916. That's all, 572, not 5,720 who later claimed to have been in the GPO in 1916. But of that 572, 41% of them opted out of the Civil War. 41% of them who again had different reasons, some wanting to get back to civilian life, some not believing it was worth a civil war in 1922, and some genuinely considering themselves to be neutral on the question. Liam de Royste, the Cork Sinn Féin TD, also kept a diary during this period. And he suggested that for the one who was actively engaged in the Civil War, there were 100 who were only passively interested. That perhaps is an exaggeration, but not everyone was fighting in 1922 and 1923. And as David Fitzpatrick recorded, there were always cows to be milked, hay to be saved, and women to be ordered about. Normal life had to go on. And yet that sense of being conflicted persisted. I got the title of my book, Between Two Hells, from a contribution that was made in a Dáil debate by P.J. Maloney, the Tipperary Sinn Féin TD, who had endured a 23-day hunger strike during the War of Independence, who had lost a son during that same conflict. And he said in the Dáil that I am no orator, I am no statesman, I am looking for guidance, I am looking for the path. He said we are being manoeuvred into a position where we have to choose between two hells. But perhaps there were three hells. He was thinking, of course, of the hell of a resumption of war with Britain, or the hell of a war between those who had fought on the same side in the previous couple of years. But the third hell he perhaps identified too. He said simply, I cannot vote myself into empire. And don't doubt the depth of the sincerity when it came to that particular view. I will allow others to go in to the military details, others much better equipped than I am in relation to military history. I would acknowledge the work of Michael Hopkinson in particular in the late 1980s, when he sought to describe in considerable detail the regional dynamics. But he also, of course, made the point that the Irish Civil War was very difficult to describe. It was a chaotic war. It had an ill-defined beginning and end. The fighting, he wrote, was erratic, it was confused, and it was highly regionalised. Take the county of Wexford, for example, where about 50 were killed during the Civil War, but only 23 were killed in that county during the War of Independence. Why was that? The regional dynamics were hugely important. The local agendas, the local struggles, the highly personalised nature of what was going on. But for all the chaos of that period, there were, of course, other forms of chaos, and chaos had many forms. For those who were living with the aftermath of the Civil War, there was a disordering, a fracturing for many of them. That is why the newly released archival material that has been mentioned has become so valuable. The space that has opened up for historians, yes, but also those who have a strong personal connection to this particular period. Being able to see the words of their relatives when it came to pension applications. And this is not about these documents being the truth. There is no such thing. But they are personal truths for those who were involved. They're raw. They're intimate. They're often also very dignified in how they compose their particular accounts and make their particular pleas. So that space has opened up for historians to get a crucial insight into the mindsets, into the afterlives, into the fractured existence for far too many, including, of course, the women. Sheila Humphreys was later to recall that after the Civil War, many Cumann women felt flattened. We felt defeated. The tinted trappings of our fight were hanging like rags around us. What a memorable description. These were women who had been subjected to more arch propaganda. J.J. Walsh famously insisting that they were women in men's clothing. Liam de Rochta, who I mentioned, recorded in his diary that these anti-treaty women were not normal human beings with normal human mentalities. They are, he insisted, monomaniacs. There is a moral sore in the heart and soul of Ireland. Mary McSweeney was frequently depicted as irrational, particularly when she went on a 3-week hunger strike in November 1922, when she took on church and state. There were over 550 Cumann members who were incarcerated during the Civil War. This was on a much greater scale than anything that had happened during the War of Independence. Many of them, too, endured hunger strikes. But they were also dealing with the prevailing cultural attitudes and winds, which made it even more difficult for them. Isn't it interesting that the Catholic bishops, when they issued a pastoral during the Civil War, wondered how decent Irish boys could degenerate so tragically? But they don't put women into that frame because they were beyond decency, those who had opposed the treaty. This was a process of dehumanizing them. And that in many respects lingered. Nora Martin, a great leader and stalwart of Cumann in County Cork, insisted in 1942 that the male overseers club in the pensions department had to be changed. One woman at least should be on that advisory board, she wrote in 1942. Lawyers and civil servants, no matter how sympathetic, can never visualize the feelings of these women. What constituted active service in Ireland during the Civil War? Did they take account of what was involved for the individual women when it came to the risks that they were taking? Did active service have to be about firing a gun? Clearly not. But there was a belittling of what they had done. They were confined, of course, to their lower grade pensions. Cumann was formerly an auxiliary group. But that process and how it worked in relation to women is a theme that can be explored in great depth now as a result of the Military Service Pension Archive. Nora Martin was writing on behalf of Ellen Carroll, who was in exile, working in a sorting office in Shepherd's Bush in London during the Blitz, and she was described by Nora as a complete wreck. And the preponderance of that description, a complete wreck, in the pension archive is something that is very, very striking. I also looked closely at the case of Joanna Cleary from Ballymore, just outside Dingle. She died in 1924 at the age of 26. She had been described by her doctor as in the full of her health a few years previously. She was the breadwinner for her family. She worked in a Cork asylum as an attendant. But she never recovered from her incarceration, from her hunger strike. There were 9 dependent children living on the family homestead on what was described as the grass of 2 cows, a description that again is seen at various stages during the pension archive. It was also recorded that her family was largely dependent on 4 other members in the United States of America. This was about the attempt by her mother to get a pension as opposed to a gratuity, a once-off payment. And that gratuity and once-off payment was just £100. There was also the case of Mary Devons that intrigued me, the widow of Seamus Devons, killed in very controversial circumstances in Ben Bulben in Sligo during the Civil War. Mary Devons, of course, lived to see the public veneration of her husband Seamus, who of course had also been a TD. There was a Piper's Band named after him. There was a row of houses that exist to this day, Ben Bulben Terrace, that was named after the 6 who were killed during that particular episode. And yet she was struggling with her mental health. She died in 1936 as a result of poisoning by Lysol, which she deliberately drank while suffering from mental depression, to give you the transcript of the relevant file in the pension archive. And what about the women of Ballyseedy? Understandably, of course, we hear about the horrors that the men endured. But it was left to Sarah Sheehy and Ellen Burke in Cumann to try and deal with the recovery of some of the remains. Sarah Sheehy and Ellen Burke never recovered. Sarah Sheehy was described in the 1930s as a chronic invalid who was attempting to live on her mother's old age pension. And she described in her pension application how she had attempted to gather bodies, brains, and clothes after the Ballyseedy massacre. How would you ever recover from those scenes? Or the case of Margaret Doherty in Foxford in County Mayo, who was described as being outraged by 3 men in succession. This was a euphemism, of course, for a gang rape. And after that, it was recorded, her mental and physical health gradually failed. The starkness of it all. We also need to think, of course, about how class permeates the pension archive. Class was not an issue that was directly related for support or opposition to the treaty. The most glaring omission, of course, from the Dáil was unskilled workers. There were few references to class in the treaty debates, but it does permeate the pension archive. Consider the Kerry cases that are relevant here. Consider the case of Joe O'Brien, for example, one of the Knocknagoshel victims who survived having had his legs amputated and was nearly blinded. His family had to beg for a wheelchair. He lived on a 2nd floor. Or consider the case of Edward Stapleton, who was also killed at Knocknagoshel. He hailed from Gloucester Street in Dublin tenement land. His wife Mary, too, finding herself in dire circumstances. There was also his widowed mother, Julia, living in the house. There's great cruelty on display when it comes to bureaucracy. This is understandable in a way. There were no soft pensions. The bar was set very high. The vast majority of those who applied for pensions were not successful. But sometimes the Department of Finance can still make you see red. The Stapletons were to endure even more tragedy when an infant son died a few years after the Civil War. The Department of Finance went to the trouble of recouping £1.17 that had been paid for the period after he died from Mary Stapleton. Consider also the case of the Kerry County Council road worker, George O'Shea, earning £2 a week. The impact that his death in Ballyseedy had on his sisters, on his mother. Described again that family as living on the grass of 5 cows. The payment of a £112 gratuity for that particular tragedy. And the long reach of the trauma that was both internal and external for that family and others. What about the Hales brothers? Sean Hales, famously assassinated as a TD in 1922. His brother, Robert, by 1948, was pleading with the pension authorities and suffering from rheumatism. What good, he wondered, is £28 per annum when a man cannot earn a living? £28 per annum, roughly the rate of a grade E, a low-grade pension as a result of his application. Or the 5 O'Neill brothers, famed, of course, for their activities with the anti-treaty IRA in West Cork. One of them believed to have fired the shot that killed Michael Collins. Look at them collectively as 5 O'Neill brothers. What you get are accounts of being on the run, death, premature death, disability, alcoholism, emigration, the pleurisy of Jeremiah O'Neill, who was described in the 1930s as a cripple with 2 sticks on a grade E pension of just £15 per annum. Or John O'Neill, who was dead at the age of 50. And he described how from 1916 to 23, he was never able to sleep in his own home. The exposure, the TB, described by 1933 as a complete wreck, living with 3 children on 10 acres. And if I do a hand's turn of work, I have terrible vomiting of blood. I ask you in the name of honesty, in the name of fair play, in the name of charity, to take my case seriously. Some of those who were adjudicating these cases, of course, were not necessarily the austere Republican founding fathers. They were doing well in politics, partly as a result of their status arising from the Civil War. Frank Eoghan, for example, as Minister for Defence, owning a very valuable dairy farm in Sandyford. The importance of the land question, the gross iniquities that find their way into this archive, the unresolved aspects of the Irish land war and the Irish land hunger. You also get Sean McEntee as Minister for Finance, sometimes trying to decide whether £100 or £112 is a fair gratuity for the loss of a loved one. A man who liked his fine tailoring and his gold watches. And this is not about suggesting that they were particularly invidious politicians, far from it. They were dealing with the restraints of a process that had been designed, as I mentioned, to be quite difficult. But you do get that sense of the terrible iniquities. Consider the fate of Paddy O'Daly, who was so involved, of course, in the horrors of Kerry in March and April 1923. His portrait by Sean Keating came to adorn the walls of the Hugh Lane Gallery. He died at home in 1957. Daniel Shea, one of the victims of the Cahersiveen outrage in March 1923, was not so lucky. He had been earning 15 shillings a week as a labourer. The family received a gratuity of £133. Or let's come back to Ernie O'Malley, who was captured in late 1922 after an attack in Dublin on the house where he was staying. Peter McCartney was the young soldier, the National Army soldier from Leitrim, who was killed in that particular episode. He was one of 9 children. Before he enlisted, he had been earning £2 a week as a painter. Even as an 86-year-old man, his father, Pat McCartney, was still pleading with the pension authorities for an increase in the £40 that he was paid after the death of his son. And that was a full and final payment. He wrote simply, "My son left his employment for the freedom of this state." Ernie O'Malley was in receipt of a combined military pension and wound pension of some £380. It was hard earned. Ernie O'Malley, of course, had endured great difficulty himself. But again, tracing these histories arising out of the same incident can be very telling, very revealing. Michael Kilroy, the hard man in Mayo IRA, responsible for the death of Joseph Ruddy, whose father Thomas insisted that the £50 that was paid to him was not just an injustice to his son, it was also an insult to his family. We also have illuminated in this archive a marvellous cross-section of medical themes and medical problems. John, or Sean Haughey as he was often known, was, by the Civil War in Mayo, leading the 61st Infantry Battalion. He was ultimately awarded a Grade E pension, but he was clearly suffering during the Civil War, referred to in these files as having fits of marked moroseness and depression. He ultimately developed multiple sclerosis. The archive of John Haughey's pension correspondence reveals so much about the sense of betrayal. He suggested that of his 7 children, the country owed them more than starvation. "I spent the best part of my life in national service." And he died in 1947. What impact did that have on the very young Charles Haughey in the 1940s and the rest of the family? What does it do to families psychologically? You also have those who cannot settle. The young George Lennon, for example, who was a teenage IRA member who had a breakdown in Waterford at the beginning of the Civil War. The way he put it was that none of us were sure where we were going to next. George Lennon lived to the age of 91. He was practicing Zen Buddhism in New York in the 1960s, still trying to find some kind of inner solace, still trying to settle himself, still trying to cure his agitation. Ultimately, he had to get testimony from a British Army veteran, ironically, in order to insist that he was suffering from, in the words of the file, traumatic neurosis, which appears to have been the direct result of his war service. When it comes to the post-war disillusionment, no side has a monopoly. Ernie O'Malley came to the conclusion that Britain was no longer his enemy. Each man finds his enemy from within. And the way Sean O'Whalan put it, the Civil War woke us up from the mesmerism of the romantic dream. It set us asking questions about the pre-sanctified dogmas of our history. And he went on to suggest that luckily, we had a succession of writers who were able to face experience and record it. And they did their artistic duty. But what we get in the pensions archive are the more prosaic battles for status, for recognition, for material survival, the long reach of that trauma, both internal and external. And many National Army veterans were treated badly too. Eddie McAteer, one of them, wrote in 1926 that some of us threw up our employment in order to enlist, and now we are without a penny to earn, while others are lucky to get back to their previous employment. The post-Civil War period required the demobilisation of some 37,000 National Army soldiers who are now part of a bloated army, an army of that size not being needed, of course, in post-Civil War Ireland. An organisation representing their welfare suggested in the late 1920s that 100 of them were living rough in the Phoenix Park. It was difficult for ex-internees on the anti-treaty side sometimes to gain employment. That was reflected in the experiences of the father of our current Uachtaráin, Michael D. Higgins, His father, John, who applied for a pension, had to wait until 1949 for an appeal and eventually was awarded his modest pension in 1956. But in many respects, it was too late. That's what prompted Uachtaráin Michael D. Higgins to write his poem, The Betrayal. You had been moved to where those dying too slowly were sent, a poorhouse no longer known by that name. Some felt they had no option but to leave the country. The work of Nolan Murchu in Kerry has been revealing about that traffic. Take Cumann, for example, in West Kerry. Of 257 recorded members during the revolutionary period, 106 of that 257 had left the country by the 1930s. 13%, it's estimated, of Cumann members had left the country after the Civil War. 30% of the West Kerry IRA had left Ireland's shores by the 1930s. There were other legacies. The Catholic Church, for all our focus on triumphalism and its unbridled power, was shaken by the Civil War, shaken by the volatility, as it saw it, of its population. It's no coincidence that they begin this preoccupation, particularly in the 1920s, with transgression, with sin, with boundaries that they are deciding as they move into a certain vacuum, that never again will this be allowed to happen. That has profound consequences for the way in which the church exercises power. There's also a political centralization which has endured to this day. The concentration of power in this state is extraordinarily centralized, and that is one of the consequences of the Civil War. There was a preoccupation, of course, for a period with the shadow of the gunmen. But there was also a valiant attempt to take the military out of politics, a successful attempt. There was also, of course, the process of the re-entry into politics of those who had fallen foul of the government in 1922 and 1923. And yet there were those who did not want to trade on their Civil War past. Eoin O'Shea makes the point that Tom McAllistrom, who had the longest Dáil career of any Kerry TD at 46 years, did not ever make reference to the Civil War during his time in the Dáil. He did give an interview to Nulla Gogaira in 1970 in which he suggested that both sides had been chastised by the Civil War, that it ultimately made them better citizens. You can argue that. We also need to be conscious of the scale of the achievement, 100 years of unbroken democracy. The late Peter Mayer, the political scientist, suggested that that was not appreciated enough. And again, it brings us back to this broader international and comparative context. We often focus, understandably, on the lost leaders. What would Michael Collins have done had he survived the Civil War? But let's not assume that Michael Collins inhabited a different ideological planet to his contemporaries. Perhaps Ireland would not have been that much different. But we do have a hierarchy of remembrance, of course. The tragedy of the fallen leader. In many respects, Arthur Griffith is forgotten, falling between two stools, associated with parliamentarianism, with compromise, with negotiation, dying at a time when politics is hardening around him. De Valera too remained preoccupied with the events of the Civil War, describing himself during the Civil War as just a humble soldier, looking at the Civil War as through a wall of glass, powerless to intervene. That was self-serving, of course, too. But what developed was what we refer to as Civil War politics, now formally over. James Dillon thundered across the Dáil floor in the 1950s about the codology of Civil War politics. What ideological differences, he asked, if words retain their meaning, divide any two deputies on either side of this house. And yet, for all the stability of stagnation, we were able to avoid the political extremes. There was also a consequence for a divided Ireland, a partitioned Ireland. The sense of abandonment endured as the focus shifted to the south. Antrim volunteers in the 1930s suggested we never knew if our position was clearly understood in Dublin. And the Civil War heightened that sense of exile, that sense of abandoning them to their fate in this new Orange state. James Gallagher from the anti-treaty IRA in Derry suggested that obstacles were being placed in the way of those who were applying from Derry for pensions based on their Civil War service. And he also reminded a Southern pension overseer of the difficulty of keeping records in the new Northern Ireland, records that were considered to be seditious documents. And of course there were the silences. Not perhaps as many silences as we sometimes insist, as the work of Siamsa Eoghan recently would suggest, but silences nonetheless. Sean Lemass was interviewed in retirement by the Irish press journalist Michael Mills in 1969, and he asked him about the Civil War. Lemass's brother Noel, of course, had been savagely mutilated in the Dublin mountains even after the end of the Civil War. And he welled up, and he responded simply, "Terrible things were done by both sides. I'd rather not talk about it." Paddy Fuller, the son of Stephen Fuller, interviewed recently, was asked about whether Stephen had spoken of Ballyseedy. This is not, of course, about the famous interview he gave in 1980, the only time he went publicly on the record, but in a more general sense. And again, the response was, it just hurt too much. Those silences we can now, in some respects, confront. We need to open it up, and that is partly, of course, what this conference is about. There is a marvellous exhibition outside by young students who are nuanced, who are understated, who are sympathetic, who are creative, who are artistic, and who are very sensitive when it comes to how to deal with the trauma that is generated by our Civil War. And that is a very uplifting thing to see, and I applaud them for it. And that's what commemoration can do, and that's what this conference can do. Our opportunities are heightened. Our opportunities to understand, to seek more nuance and less certainty and righteousness. Gur míle maith.
Thank you very much, Diarmaid. That was just an extraordinary tour de force. And particularly listening to the stories from the pensions files, even reading them 100 years later still is so emotive and affecting, but also opens up those questions and those sureties we've had about civil war, which you so wonderfully elucidated there. They're no longer there, and it's a good thing. It's a good thing that they're no longer there, particularly, you know, in my own area of research about the women. And you mentioned George O'Shea. Of course, his sister, Molly O'Shea, lost her mind dealing with the aftermath of Ballyseedy and ended up in an asylum for most of her life. And other people survived and got on with life. But I think this is, as you say, what this conference will do. It will ask those questions, consider those legacies, and look at that. But I get to talk all about that on Saturday, and other people will talk about other aspects of that. So I will throw open to the audience now if anybody has any questions. Can I see any? Put your hand up, and we have roving mics. Over here? Yeah?
Don Morocco, Connacht Nagashil, where a lot of the trouble started here in Kerry. I would like to ask a question. Very recently, a journalist from one of our main daily papers spent 2 days here in Kerry recently researching the mine at Knocknagoshel. He came up with the conclusion that the explosion was triggered off from an irregular dugout a mile away. Now, would you have any facts on that, as it's not the local view in Knocknagoshel that happened?
As I mentioned at the outset, I am no military expert, and I would not at all be in a position to know about the the electrical currents of Knocknagoshel or how exactly that was triggered. I honestly don't. And it's not an area that I've looked at in detail. What I suppose I concentrated on were the pension applications of those who were affected by it. So I was looking more at the consequences and the aftermath. But the actual triggering of the explosion itself, no, I wouldn't be able to illuminate that in any way. Sorry.
As somebody from hearing the story growing up in the local area, I'd always presumed as when they moved the boulder that it triggered the trap mine. And would they have had the technology to trigger a mine from a mile away? I don't know, but yeah, that's an interest. It just shows how histories can change over the course of a century with looking at things with new eyes. And maybe it's not right. Maybe what we had held to be true is the right story. But again, as Diarmaid said during his talk, there are no truths. We have to continuously question. So anybody else over here? Oh, here, Pat.
A question I think that's relevant in the context of the current debate in Northern Ireland about an amnesty. The government at the time introduced an amnesty for its own forces in 1923, I think, and followed it up very shortly afterwards with an amnesty for a Republican side, which meant that perpetrators on both sides essentially escaped. Was the amnesty a good idea? Did it work?
Yes. The indemnity legislation that was introduced in 1923 was then pragmatically extended to the anti-treaty side. That was, it was pragmatic. It was also seen as necessary, partly, of course, to prevent accountability. We know that there were desperate cover-ups and travesties when it came to supposed investigations into what had happened, and Paddy O'Daly was very relevant there. There were gross lies read into the Dáil record, for example. But you have to make a decision, I suppose, and it comes fairly early in Ireland, about whether or not you are going to make that a part of your politics, that there's this constant focus on the Civil War. A lot of people didn't want that. And that indemnity or amnesty was partly about seeking to take those issues away. You don't get rid of Civil War politics, obviously, but what you do is you try and prevent 1922 and 1923 being the continual focus. And that is hugely difficult for people who are looking for accountability or justice. But, you know, in that post-war situation, or that post-conflict situation, it also had a lot going for it in relation to recovery. And we have to remind ourselves, Ireland recovered quickly from its civil war. You know, there are pacts of forgetting. Sometimes you hear this in relation to the Spanish Civil War, for example, which is a more recent civil war than our own, a kind of a pact of forgetting. And, you know, it's almost a pragmatic recognition that you're never going to do justice to what happened when it comes to accountability or when it comes to the satisfaction of either side. So there has to be a certain veil thrown over the events. Now that operates in all sorts of different ways then at local level, as has been alluded to there. You know, that doesn't mean people stop thinking or asking questions or having their own versions or their own theories. But it does mean that, you know, in a national sense, the politics is not going to be consumed by 1922 and 1923, by the specific events of 1922 and 1923. And perhaps because our war was so short, that made it easier too. It's a lot more complicated if you're dealing with a 30-year conflict, for example.
Anybody else? Can I see? Oh, here, down the front.
I've read somewhere that Desmond Fitzgerald, father of Garrett Fitzgerald, he was in the first state government, Did he destroy or give the orders for a lot of records to be destroyed before De Valera came into power?
He did.
Right.
There was material that was deemed to be so sensitive that you couldn't have it in the hands of those who are now taking the reins of power. The context there, of course, was, well, there are different contexts. There was great fear in 1932 about what this transition might mean. I mentioned the shadow of the gunmen then. You know, you can see those posters in 1932, which are trading on that idea that power, you cannot trust these people with power, that they're under the influence of communists and the shadow of the gunmen, the IRA and so on. So that was very much a part of the atmosphere. But of course, what was done was also profoundly wrong for a government minister to destroy those records. But it is a reminder of the sensitivity around it. But I mean, that order is documented, and it's a destruction order.
Thank you.
Over here? Yep. It's going to do.
Dies Margaret Diarmaid agus Fáilte Rash go Kerry. I have two things really. First of all, why can't I get a death certificate of Michael Collins, my granduncle? And secondly, what are your views on the Ballyseedy controversy now? Should the public record be corrected?
Yes, the public record should be corrected. But what do you correct it to? That's a complication. I think there needs to be an acknowledgement that the account that was recorded for the Dáil record was completely erroneous, you know. That I doubt that is going to happen, because the obvious response will be, well, if you do it for that, where do we go next with this? Are we just going to open up a whole new phase of recriminatory politics? It's interesting that the current Taoiseach has referred very specifically to the illegality of what happened and referred to it as an outrage. He referred to it as a war crime. So there has been an acknowledgement at that senior level of government, but whether that's going to translate into an amendment of the Dáil record, I doubt it. But I can see a very strong case to be made as to why that should not be allowed to stand. In relation to the death certificate of Michael Collins, I don't know. Is it deemed to be something that you have no entitlement to, or is there a question mark over its existence?
Yeah, well, I think they refused to have an inquest, and because there wasn't an inquest, they refused a death certificate.
Yeah.
And why wasn't there an inquest, even belatedly? It raised a lot of questions.
Yeah, and they weren't going to open that up again, you know, no more than what we've been discussing previously about letting certain things lie.
Anybody? Oh, here. Yeah.
Hi, my question is about the idea of civil war politics. And the first thing is civil war politics, or was civil war politics truly about the Civil War, if we're referring to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? And secondly, do you share my irritation with the squashing, if you like, of civil war memory only into the competition between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a fair point. We've had very interesting discussions about the work of Padraig Yates, for example, in recent years, where he was making the point that even during the decade of commemorations that we've been through, there were moments there, particularly in relation to even this 100 years on from 1922 and 1923, the role that the labour movement played, particularly in the run-up to the Civil War, and the role that they played in orchestrating protests and strikes and representing those who, again, wanted to prioritise labour issues and bread and butter issues, that doesn't get its due attention because it's squeezed. Again, it's squeezed by the preoccupation with the other questions, the constitutional questions, the debate over the treaty, and so on. So, I mean, I think that's a fair point about that being a serious omission. There are those in 1922 and 1923 who don't define themselves according to what we refer to as Civil War politics. There's a sizable number of them. When you begin to break down the vote, even in June 1922, there were more votes cast for parties other than anti and pro-treaty Sinn Féin combined. You know, there's a very strong showing for independence and for Labour and the farmers, which suggests quite an appetite. It also suggests, I suppose, that there were some who felt that a lot of these questions about oaths and the constitutional questions were quite abstract when it came to how they impinged on their daily lives. So I think that's an important point. What was the other part of your question? Sorry.
So was so-called Civil War politics between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael truly about the Civil War at all? Yeah.
Well, it was initially. It becomes about something else then, doesn't it? The way in which politics develops, particularly from the 1930s, there's a very strong sense articulated by Fianna Fáil that the owners of the donkey and cart class are replacing the pony and trap class. That they are, in some respects, stealing the Labour Party's political clothes in the 1930s with an emphasis on welfare and state intervention, and not so much attending to the vested interests in a way that the previous government had been associated with. So, you know, definitely a class dimension enters that. So it does become, over the decades, about something else. And yet, ultimately, Civil War politics becomes very much about centrism, which is the point I think James Dillon was making in the 1950s when he talked about the codology, that they are not divided on the major questions the longer they're in existence. And, you know, even when it comes to more recent decades, about the economic model, the management of the economy, the question of Europe, you know, there's an awful lot of consensus around them. And that would suggest, of course, that the divisions as they existed were not on the big ideological questions. They were more rooted in I remember Mary Holland writing about this in the early part of this century, the late Mary Holland, where she concluded that she was glad that we had Civil War politics in Ireland, that it was rooted in whose grandfather shot whose grandfather, because it allowed us to escape the extremes of our so-called more sophisticated neighbours. And she was referring specifically to Margaret Thatcher and that sense of social cohesion breaking down and war being declared on certain sectors. And there was food for thought in that. She wasn't making light of the Civil War or what gave rise to Civil War politics, but that had there been a much more stronger ideological bent to it, it could have made things more difficult. That's the argument she was making, and there's some merit in that argument.
Thanks. Time for one more? Yeah.
I just want to...
Oh, wait, could you hold on until we get the mic?
I just wanted to compliment you on a very erudite expose on the consequences of the Civil War. And as you alluded to, the Taoiseach, the present Taoiseach has made some comments that are apologetic towards the wrongs that were done. Do you not think this forum would be a better forum for him to make those comments at? And would Eoghan na Héireann give us a very erudite expose on the socio-economic consequences of those who fought on the right side of the Civil War?
Well, she has partly done through his Machnamh series as well, in trying to, I think he has an interest in that as a sociologist as well, about looking at the economic basis for the divides and what that meant for the kind of society that Ireland was and became. And yes, absolutely, there is certainly scope for that discussion. And, you know, in relation to apologies, politicians are not going to start issuing apologies for what happened during the Civil War, for an obvious reason, that how do you decide the parameters of your Civil War apologies? Who makes the apologies on behalf of whom? How does it work in practice? Is there a need for the state to do more in relation to commemoration of the Civil War? I would argue, yes, there is. How they do it is an interesting question. Would it be worth, for example, the leaders, our political leaders across the spectrum, devoting some time in the Dáil to offering their reflections on the Civil War without it developing into a forum for recrimination or accusations? It would be very interesting to see how our political leaders see the events of 100 years now, given the importance of the Civil War for us as a people and the consequences, including for politics. I think that'll be a very interesting exercise. But this question of whether politicians today have to apologise for what happened 100 years ago is always going to be loaded and complicated, and it's going to be avoided.
Thank you.
I'll take one more from the audience. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, thank you. My question would be about similar polarization, not in politics, but in academia. You brought up the very interesting example of Tom Garvin having very partisan and ideologically tinted views on the Civil War. I'm a current PhD student at Queen's University Belfast, and I've encountered a lot of similar examples in my own work. So my question would be, what do you think is the reason that not just politics, where this would be kind of expected, but also academia, experts, are often in Irish history so biased and ideologically motivated when it comes to their views on not just this period, but a lot of others as well, and how do we go about correcting that partisan bias?
Well, academics do not exist outside of the time in which they are living and working. And scholars were greatly influenced by the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And, you know, when I'm talking about some of the views that were being expressed in the 1990s, they weren't necessarily about 1922. They were as much about 1992 and what was going on then. And, you know, it was very interesting to look at the trajectory, too, of another one of my lecturers back then, Ronan Fanning, the late Ronan Fanning, who was a very fine historian and particularly focused on Anglo-Irish relations. But he was writing in more recent years, later in his career, particularly in the book Fatal Path, about the effectiveness of violence in forcing the British government to negotiate and taking them beyond what they were prepared to offer in the absence of violence. Ronan Fanning would not have made that argument in the 1990s, but he was making it after the peace process and during that period, which again is a reminder that that climate is going to influence how all of us treat the past. And the same is true today, not in the context of an ongoing violence in Northern Ireland, but, you know, we are guided now by other positions or by other influences. We have an interest, many of us, in highlighting what we regard as neglected or marginalised figures or themes or experiences. That's a product of the Ireland that we have lived through as well. It's also, I suppose, partly about the democratisation of source material. A lot of the scholars that I'm thinking about in the 1990s were really interested in the elites. A lot of the sources that they were working with were the sources generated by those elites. So it's a different kind of history. But they were also products of their time. And, you know, UCD, for example, the institution itself, it's very interesting to look at the history of that organisation and the kind of people who ended up working there. You know, there was a time when, say, the collections in the UCD archive would have lent more towards one side than the other, but it evened out over the decades when it became clear that the important point was to get people to deposit material as opposed to what side they might have been on in 1922. So, you know, things evolve, and, you know, we shouldn't forget the climate that existed within academia. There's no a magic wand for this. You know, you're always going to have ideologically driven scholars. I mean, I've noticed that in recent years. There are a lot of academics who are activists now. You know, when it comes to justice campaigns, or when it comes to a particularly difficult or even harrowing theme associated with our history, that they feel there is an onus on them to make common cause with those who are seeking truth or those who are seeking justice. And again, you know, that can be problematic in all sorts of ways. And if you, I mean, I quote James Smith, you'll be familiar with this, Mary, as well, in relation to the theme of institutionalization. And, you know, he just wrote about the difficulty of balancing academic detachment with the moral outrage you might feel about particular things that have been revealed to us really over the last 30 years. You know, there has been a constant flow of revelation of very, very difficult and traumatic themes. And again, you know, academics have to grapple with that in relation to what their role might be. And we don't all sing from the same hymn sheet. In the same way that there was an interesting and sometimes rancorous debate about what constituted revisionism. Revisionism in the sense of what all historians should be doing, revising in light of evidence and new perspectives, or revisionism as a political stance, as a political weapon. But the idea that historians or political scientists collectively injected themselves with some kind of revisionist virus, you know, was really exaggerated. You know, an awful lot of these people are working on their own particular projects, but they are always going to be influenced by what they've experienced and by their own politics, even if they like to think they exist outside of it. They don't.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take advantage as chair just to ask one question. You mentioned the exhibition outside, and that was done by the students at MTU Tralee and Kerry College. And now with access to all these new sources and secondary school students doing these projects using the sources because they've been digitized, do you see this transforming the next generation's view of the Civil War, the Revolutionary period, and the next generation of historians who are going to come along?
Oh, I've no doubt, yeah. And we have to be careful too. I mean, I remember when the Bureau of Military History statements were released in 2003, I think. And, you know, historians have been waiting for them for a long time. They're very accessible, they're available online, and students of history are quoting them all the time. The difficulty sometimes is that they're not mediated effectively. People assume that they are biblical truth. They're not. They're also about people giving their testimony sometimes 30 more years after the events. And that is hugely problematic in all sorts of ways. And that's not to dismiss them or to discount their importance, but they have to be mediated. They have to be treated with a degree of caution. We have to treat all our sources with a degree of caution and consider how they were generated. And we have to add caveats and qualifications. So yes, there's great potential and great scope there, but they have to be reminded of the limitations too of this material. But again, there will be a plethora, I think, of scholarship that is built around the pensions process and new angles, and it's very much about generational change too when it comes to scholarship, which is a very healthy thing. But you know, I suppose the longer it's in use, the more people might discover that they can't be overly reliant on it too, and there's no harm in that. I mean, this process can be quite cyclical, but there is an opportunity, I think, and this is relevant to what Martin Mansur was saying earlier on about the potential for local study, and you can see that even in that exhibition there, and what can be done with identifying sources relating to the happenings in a particular locale, and that has been done across the country. And a lot of the local authorities have done terrific work when it comes to exhibitions and school projects and introducing students to source material. But it needs to be accompanied by a recognition and acknowledgement that these are not definitive versions.
Not the full truth, the whole truth. Okay, unless anyone is absolutely dying to ask a question, I think we shall draw the proceedings to a close and give healthy Kerry thanks to Professor Diarmaid Ferriter.
Thank you very much to Diarmaid and to Mary. I think it's fair to say that the appetite has been suitably whetted this evening, and that The discussion is now underway in earnest. I'd like to thank Diarmaid in particular for sharing so much knowledge and for posing so many important questions which will certainly guide and inform the agenda over the next few days. A reminder again that you can enjoy, if you're not here in person over the next few days, you can enjoy the proceedings online on kerrycivilwarconference.ie. If you Google Kerry Civil War Conference, you'll find us. We look forward to seeing you over the coming days and to hearing from all of our exceptional array of talented and experienced speakers. And we do hope that you'll join in the conversation if you're on social media to generate even more interest and to continue the discussion about the events of a century ago in Kerry. Gurv Mila Mahagov Kaler. Agus Ihawa.